everyone, Ellie here, and today we are going to be working on my punk rock Hanamaru costume. Yay! A few weeks ago, we finished up the skirt-short combination of this costume, and today we are going to be working on the bodice. This bodice has lots of really fun details, and I'm so excited to share some new techniques with you. So let's get started. Hanamaru's bodice features beautiful princess seams, a fold over with some very nice details on the front, a side accent panel, large gold piping all the way around, epaulets on both shoulders, and some studded cuffs on the sleeves. To start off on this project, we are going to be constructing the fashion layer and the lining layer of our bodice. I already altered a store-bought pattern to fit Hanamaru's jacket, so we don't have to worry about altering a pattern. We can simply cut out our materials. For the fashion layer, I'm going to be using the same stretch pleather that I used for my shorts, and I'm going to flat line it to some green felt. This felt is going to give the jacket a bit more body, so it'll feel more professional and like a real military jacket, rather than being flimsy and flowy like if we just use the pleather. And then I'm going to be lining our jacket with some very basic quilting cotton. As always, I started by cutting everything out, and then I flatlined our pleather to the felt. Once everything was in place, I went ahead and stitched our pieces together. For Hanamaru's jacket, I decided to add a little bit of extra detail and added some gold piping to the princess seams in the back. This is just a little extra detail, and you wouldn't see this in any of the illustrations, so it's kind of my own personal touch. I simply made this gold piping from some pleather that I had laying around. I made quite a bit of it since I know I'm going to be needing a lot of it for this costume. Once the shell of my jacket is put together, it's time to insert the accent panel. I cut this panel from my spoonflower material, and then I went ahead and interfaced it to give it a little bit more body. Along this panel, there are also some lines of gold piping. In order to make this piping really clean and not have any curves, I'm going to be ending the piping at the top corner. So I simply attach my piping along one side first, ending at the corner, and then I attach it up the other side, ending at the corner as well. This way you get a really nice crossover when you look at it from the right side. With our accent panel inserted, it's now time to finish up the shoulders and attach our sleeves. So now we have this really nice base jacket. But there are a lot of accents to add, like, oh my gosh, a lot. I'm going to start by adding the gold piping that goes all the way around the outside edges of this jacket. I'm going to be using the same gold piping that I used on my skirt. And like I said in the last video, this stuff is kind of a pain to work with. It's really, really big and it's meant for upholstery, so it doesn't necessarily flow very well, but I'm gonna make it work. To attach this piping, I went ahead and pinned it all the way around the edges of my jacket, making sure to catch both layers of the twill tape in my pin. Once it was pinned into place, I basted it on using my machine. Now, this piping is so thick that my machine presser foot won't actually touch the fabric, so you have to be very, very careful, and it's really tricky. So just a fair warning, if I were to do this again, I might hand stitch it or try to find an industrial machine that I could use, because my poor little Bernina did not like it at all. But once I got that basted into place, I saw that I really loved the way it looked. So I went over that again with a regular stitch to hold everything into place. Now we can go ahead and add some more details. The next thing I'm going to add is the studs that go along our accent panel. I ordered these studs off of eBay and I got a really good deal. I got like 14 ounces of studs for $7. To insert these studs, I'm gonna go ahead and press the little pointy ends all the way through all the layers of my jacket. So that's the fashion layer as well as the felt layer. Once you turn that over, I can use my needle nose pliers to turn over those little pointy bits and make sure they hold in place. I'm going to be using my ruler to space out these studs and make sure that they are at least somewhat evenly placed. With the studs on the accent panel finished, I'm going to go ahead and move on to these little green details along the front of Hanamaru's bodice. Now these threw me for a loop. Like, wow. I spent at least 2 weeks working on these because I just didn't know how I wanted to complete them. At first, I thought that I was going to use piping and go all the way around the edges with some piping. I thought that would look really clean and it would match all the other details on my costume. But no, it did not. It did not work in the slightest. So that was a bust. After that, I decided to try some satin stitching because satin stitching's easy. It looks really good generally, and I knew how to do it. So I tried some basic satin stitching, and then I tried satin stitching over my piping cording, and neither of those looked very good either. So my next attempt was some bias tape. I used bias tape around all of my edges, and then I stitched in the ditch to finish it off. And this looked okay, but it still felt really bulky. It didn't feel right. So after spending like a week trying to figure this out, I went onto my personal Twitter account and I asked some of my sewing friends for their opinions. And my good friend Mandy suggested something I hadn't even thought of. This is called soutache braid. It's a Russian braid, and it's made of 2 lines of cording that are then covered by various types of thread, including metallic thread or nylon, etc., etc. And this method is used for very beautiful and intricate embroideries. You see it a lot on military jackets, or you can also see it in lots of different types of like curly swervy jewelry. It's a very beautiful method, and it hadn't even crossed my mind. So I ordered some soutache braid, and thankfully this method worked awesome. It looks so clean and it looks very militaristic, which is perfect for this punk rock inspired costume. So I went ahead and cut out these designs from some interfaced green fabric, and I attached those to my jacket with a very loose zigzag stitch. Once those were held in place, I went over top with my soutache braid and just a basic straight stitch. This was a really easy method and it looks beautiful. In order to create this method, you simply stitch over the top of your soutache braid, and when you get to corners, you leave your needle into the corner, lift your foot, and twist the fabric. It's really simple. The only semi-complicated part was that I wanted my 2 layers to look like they were done at the same time. So after going around once, I had to then feed the rest of my braid underneath one of my other layers, but that was pretty easy, and it made it so I had a really nice place to hide the edges of my braid. Once I had those front pieces in place, I then had to deal with this little corner embroidery. Now, at first, I had purchased some golden lace, and I had cut out part of the lace to attach sort of as an applique. I thought that this would be easy and look pretty good. But the color of the lace wasn't quite right, and it looked sort of cheap. It just wasn't working, especially not after adding the braiding on the top. So I had an idea. I was going to use the braiding to create this little applique. So I removed a little bit of my golden piping so I have access to that entire corner, and went ahead with some golden thread and quilted where I wanted this applique to be. In the illustration, this applique looks like it's on some sort of netting and has that very obvious netted background. Since I'm not going to be using netting, I thought that quilting would create kind of the same effect. So I went through and quilted this little corner. Once it was quilted, I went back over it with my soutache braid. I went around the scallops as seen in the illustration, and I did some fun little twisty accents at the scallop points as well. Once those were attached, I went ahead and created the 3 little flower petals that are in the corner. This turned out awesome. I really love the way this looks. So with the braid attached, I went ahead and reattached my piping, and then I added a few accent studs as well. So now that we have the main details of Hanamaru's jacket done, it's time to move on to the epaulets on her shoulders. These epaulets go from her collar all the way out to the shoulder, and they have some gold piping along the edges. And also one of them has some fringe on it too, so we have some fun details to play with. So these are a very simple shape. They're basically a long rectangle with one curved edge. I went ahead and cut these out of our fashion layer, our lining, as well as some heavy duty interfacing. And then I went through and attached our piping to our fashion layer. One of Hanamaru's epaulets also has this gold fringe attached to it. In order to recreate this, I decided to order a bunch of gold tassels, and then I sewed them in as I was creating the epaulets. So I attached the cording to our fashion layer, and then I went through and attached our gold tassels as well. Once everything was in place, I simply sandwiched all of that between our lining layer and was able to flip it inside out to create these beautiful epaulets. Once we had our layers turned inside out, I went ahead and inserted our interfacing as well, just to make these a little bit stiffer. With all of that in place, I also attached gold studs to both of our epaulets, just to give them a little bit of flair. Now, in order to attach these, I'm going to remove a little bit of the gold piping along the neck, and then I'm going to slide these into place and reattach with the gold piping. Very simple. After that, I'm going to go ahead and tack them onto the edges of the shoulders. Next, we're going to move on to Hanamaru's collar. This collar is made from the same green material as the accents on the front of her jacket, and it has this beautiful gold piping around it. At first, I thought that I might use my very thick gold cording, but I realized that that would be ridiculous and uncomfortable around my neck, so I used my thinner gold piping. Quite honestly, I've always struggled with collars. They never look right. I follow patterns, I do everything correctly, but they never sit properly. So this collar took me a good 4 or 5 tries before I got it to look right. One thing that I noticed is that it's very important to interface your material. And also, if you're going to be using a pleather piping like I am, you're gonna wanna use a Teflon foot, or here's a little sewing tip. If you put a little bit of tape right underneath your presser foot, it'll help that glide right over the pleather when it normally would stick and pull. So I attached my piping all the way around my collar and then finished it off with a lining, turned it inside out, pressed it, and we're good to go. Thank goodness. I simply attached my collar onto the jacket, stitching as close as possible to my gold cording. And voila, the collar stands up and it looks really, really good. The next thing we need to work on are these awesome cuffs on this jacket. The cuffs are made of this really cool white material. They have studs all the way around them, as well as our thick gold cording. To create these, I measured the edges of my sleeves and saw how big they were and cut out strips of my vinyl to the same length. I'm actually using vinyl that is used for tablecloths and things like that, but I picked this because it has a really nice texture and it's going to add a bit more body to the costume. Once I had my pieces cut out, I went ahead and stitched them together at the edges, creating a bunch of little tubes that are about the size of my arm. And now the tricky part. We have to add that thick gold piping to both edges of these white bands. So I'm going to go ahead and very carefully stitch all the way around these edges, making sure to get both layers of that twill tape. Once I get to the point where my 2 edges meet, I'm gonna have to do some alterations. Otherwise, I'm going to be sewing through 2 layers of inch-thick piping, and my machine will not do that. There's just no way. What I did is I used my seam ripper to disconnect the piping from the twill tape, and then I untwisted my 3 layers of braid. Now I'm able to spread them out a little bit more evenly along that top edge, and my machine won't have to sew through all 6 layers at the same time. Instead, it's maybe only 1 or 2 layers. And it looks really nice! Once that was attached, it was time to go through and add all of our studs. I did this in the same method as I did the studs along our accent panel, making sure to space them out somewhat evenly. And now that our studs are attached, I'm gonna go ahead and attach our cotton lining. I'm going to line this up along the top edge and stitch as closely as possible to our gold piping. And then once you flip that inside out, it should look really, really clean. With our cuffs finished, it's time to attach them to our jacket. I'm going to attach these directly to the sleeves of our fashion layer. So when you do a cuff that folds all the way over, it can be a little bit confusing on which side to put to which side. So I put the right side of my cuff to the wrong side of my sleeve. This way, once I fold them all the way out, it'll look correct and you won't be seeing my lining on the outside or anything like that. And once that stitch was finished, I was able to turn these cuffs all the way inside out, and they look so good! I love them! Oh my gosh. Now, if you wanted to be extra careful or make this jacket extra nice, you could go in and finish that seam by hand just to make sure there were no raw edges. This is something that I'll do eventually, but I haven't done it yet. At this point, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. All that's left is to attach our lining and then our closures. So to attach our lining, I'm putting right sides together and pinning all the way around. I'm going to be stitching from both edges of the collar all the way around the outside of the jacket, and then I'm going to turn this inside out. Once I make sure that it still fits and looks right, I'm going to clip all of that seam allowance and clip into the curves and the corners as well. To finish off the lining, I'm going to do a blind stitch around the top edge of the collar, and then I'm also going to do blind stitches along the hems of both of our sleeves, making sure that you won't be able to see any of our green felt that's lining our jacket. To finish off this jacket, I'm going to be using closures. I'm going to attach snaps all the way down the side of the visible edge, as well as one in the top right corner of the non-visible edge to make sure that that doesn't flap around at all. In total, I used 6 snaps finishing this jacket just because I want to make sure it doesn't have any chance of flying open. And thankfully, that was all that was left on our jacket. It is now complete. So I'm really happy with the way this jacket came out. I think that the soutache braiding that we used really helped up the level of this costume and made it look a little bit more professional and realistic than if I had used bias tape or satin stitch or anything like that. I also really like the materials that we chose. I again think they look really realistic and super rock and roll. In the end, I have a few alterations I'd like to make. I need to fix the way that the epaulets are sitting. They don't sit quite right, and I struggle to move my arms a lot in this costume. So in the comments below, make sure you let me know what you think of this jacket. Is it totally punk rock or does it fall flat? I would love to hear what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like so I know that you're liking this series. And of course, comments are awesome as well. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions and what you might have done differently. And if you're enjoying my content, please make sure to subscribe so that way you know when my new videos come out. I try to post at least 2 times a week and I would love for you to see them all. So that is it for this part of Hanamaru. Next time we'll be working on accessories like her gloves, her hat, her boots, etc. So I can't wait to see you then. Until next time everyone, keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun.